when I woke up, very confused. She said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an IRONCLAD original. Welcome to On the X. My guest today is Dr. Sunita Sah, an award-winning professor at Cornell University's S.C. Johnson Graduate School of Management and a leading voice in behavioral science. With a unique background as a former physician and management consultant, Dr. Sah brings a powerful multidisciplinary lens to her research on influence, authority, and the psychology of saying no. She holds degrees in medicine, psychology, an MBA, and a PhD in organizational behavior. Her work has shaped how we understand trust, conflicts of interest, and the subtle forces that guide our decisions, often without us realizing it. She's advised top organizations, served as a commissioner on the National Commission of Forensic Science, and is the author of Defy, The Power of No in a World That Demands Yes. So here we go with Dr. Sunita Sah on the X. Oh, so let's get into your work here in your book, Defy, which is a really interesting topic that I had never, I guess, thought about or even considered as a thing. So what got you interested in this along your career path? When did this become a topic that was front of mind for you?
I was always fascinated by people that could defy, even when I was young, because I grew up with what I call a masterclass in compliance. Mm-hmm. So I was really known for being an obedient daughter and a student, and I did what I was told. And I even remember asking my dad when I was young, what does my name mean? And he said, in Sanskrit, Sunita means good. So I mostly lived up to that. So I went to school on time, did my homework as expected, even had my hair cut the way my parents wanted me to. And these were the messages I received, that to be good really translated to me as to obey, do what I'm told, don't question authority, be polite, all of these things. And so I became fascinated and I became very compliant because I started to equate being compliant with being good and being defiant with being bad. But the people that could defy, I was fascinated with. So it came from that sort of really young age of being fascinated with that. And then when I went to study medicine and psychology, I started to delve into some things and I saw some serious problems with being so compliant. So, of course, in psychology, I came across, Stanley Milgram's infamous experiments on obedience to authority and the giving, people harmful electric shocks if they're just told by someone else. And Milgram himself described the ones that did give the most severe shocks, going up to 450, the people that reached the end. He described them as the obedient subjects, and the ones that said no to the experimenter as the defiant subjects. And when I looked into sort of other surveys and research, I found that 9 out of 10 healthcare workers, most of them nurses, don't speak up when they see a colleague making an error or a physician making an error, or find it very uncomfortable. And it's not just in healthcare, it's like across other industries as well. In another survey of other 1,700 crew members on commercial airlines, only half of them feel comfortable speaking up when they see a mistake. So these are situations where we really do want people speaking up. And I started to then wonder, is it sometimes bad to be so good? And what do we actually sacrifice by being so compliant? And that's when I became really fascinated in it. I started doing research. I really saw the high level of compliance that we have. And in my experiments, that sort of compliance in certain conditions can get as high as 85%, 90%, even when people know it's really bad advice that they're being given, they follow it. And now that I've spent decades, studying sort of influence, advice, and authority, what I really found, and that really changed how I think, is that we've just simply misunderstood what it means to defy. And we have this negative connotation of defiance,
Yes.
but my revelation was that we need actually a new definition for defiance.
Yeah, I agree with you on the negative connotation for sure, because when I hear that word, it's exactly that. It strikes me as a negative word. So there's a whole bunch of stuff you talked about in there, because I want to talk about those experiments as well that are in the book. But let's kind of back up to, like, you talked about kids, and I'm cut from the same cloth as you. I was a very obedient kid. I wanted to follow the rules. I felt like I should follow the rules. I was very uncomfortable breaking the rules. So, but it strikes me like as children, we need some level of that, right? I mean, like as a society, it can't just be everybody just do whatever you want all the time. Like we sort of adopt this into culture because you have to have that. So like, I guess what I'm asking is with kids, is there a good place to defy? Because the kids that were defiant when I was a kid, when I would think of defiant, they were like the rule breakers. They were all like the rejects and the hooligans and the, right? Like they, I don't know that they were the most contributing members to school.
So this all goes down to how do you define defiance? And so the Oxford English Dictionary definition of defiance is to challenge the power of another person, to resist boldly and openly. And as we just discussed, I grew up in the UK, so I'm not one to disagree with the Oxford English Dictionary that often. But in this case, I do think it's too narrow and it doesn't honor our agency. And my definition is that to defy is to act in accordance with your true values when there is pressure to do otherwise. Okay. So we're reframing it as a positive act, a proactive positive force in society. Now, you mentioned children, which is really interesting. Children, and you said that you grew up with a similar background to me, that we are so trained for compliance that we find it really difficult to defy when we get older, because we have all this training and compliance, but we've never actually been trained for defiance when we need to be defiant. And we can actually train our children for that. So a couple of points. Yes, when a child is labeled defiant, it's usually seen as a negative thing. And some of the things that you described, like it could be oppositional, right, is one of the terms that's used for children. And, we often see it in teenagers as well, right? That if I tell my son to do something, sometimes he, as a teenager, will do the exact opposite of what I asked him to do. Now, you could say that's defiance. I label that as false defiance, because if we're going with my definition of defiance, and I can also talk about what consent and compliance are, but both consent and defiance come from within, right? So you're connecting with your values and you're acting in alignment with them. But if you are just doing the exact opposite of what somebody else tells you to do, yes, you're being oppositional, but what you're doing is, again, determined by the external situation, by somebody else telling you something. So it's not actually defiant in my definition of defiance. It's actually totally reliant on somebody else, which to me is not being very independent. It's not being defiant. It's not living by your own internal values. It's actually being compliant with other people, but in an oppositional way. And so if we really understand what defiance is, then it does take on this positive connotation rather than the negative one. And with children, how can we train them? So children, like people say, do children actually know their values? How can they act in alignment with their values? Well, actually, children are very sensitive to certain things, especially fairness. And especially if you have siblings, you know about fairness as a child. And we can discuss values with our children. And as well as training them for compliance when they need to, we also train them for defiance. So we can say, if you see one of your school classmates being ignored or left out of a group, you can speak up and you can say, I don't think that's right. Let's include them. So there's many ways that we can teach our children to defy when something is wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, something you said in there struck me though. Don't you need an opposing party? Like you need an externality in order to defy, right? I mean, just acting in accordance with your values. If there's no thing you're going against, that can't be an act of defiance, right?
So yeah, my definition is to act in accordance with your true values when there is pressure to do otherwise.
Okay, got it. So just to hang on the kid thing a little bit, though, that is an interesting, I think that's a really hard struggle, because I think for the longest time, kids it was very much about obedience and sort of compliance. And like, we have, everyone wears this to school, and you sit here at this desk and you do this. And I'm sure there was a little bit of what you're kind of talking about. Hey, you see someone who's being mistreated, like you need to stand up for them, that kind of thing. I'm sure there was that. I think that has become certainly more prevalent. Like, hey, you need to, like, if you see something wrong, you need to speak out. But it's sort of the stuff that's in between there, right? Where there's been almost a pendulum swing the other way, I think, with a lot of parenting, certainly, where it's like, we just let them go, and they figure it out for themselves, and they express themselves. And it's like, yeah, but your kid is out of control and disruptive. Like, at some point there needs to be a parental intervention there to say that's not appropriate. So how do you thread that needle, right? Because I totally get what you're saying. Like, yes, it's something we should figure out how to train. I almost feel like there should be a different word too. Like, you need to coin
Yes,
a new term.
I think what you're describing there really isn't, what you're describing there is somebody who's not following maybe the rules, or somebody who's, when you say out of control, it could mean so many different things, right? And it's not about just freely expressing yourself. It's like, I mean, what value are they chasing here? Yeah. And, we could say freedom. So we do have two aspects to ourselves, that we have our ideal self and independent self. So we have our dependent self, interdependent self, and independent self. So our independent self, our ideal independent self, wants to do whatever we want to do. And we want our agency, our freedom, our autonomy. But our interdependent self values harmony and relationships. And the two ideals are actually, there's always a bit of tension between them, because they're ideals. We can never achieve one or the other. And that's a good thing that we would not want to. So there's always some element of tension within that. And when we're talking about, yes, for society to operate, we need some cooperation. We have to obey traffic laws. We have to obey other things. That's not the kind of defiance that I'm saying, that we should ignore all those laws and what drives society is run on a certain level of compliance. I'm talking about being defiant and being bad when we to actually do the right thing in the end. Yeah. Because if we become so ingrained to think of defiance as bad, it really has this shift in our minds of, oh, I can't do that. I'm being the difficult person. I'm being the difficult employee, speaking up at work when I see an error, or us going down the wrong path, or my boss taking a shortcut. And that is actually not a great thing for the organization or for society. And so we need to, for the people who are unable to speak up because they've had such a masterclass in defiance growing up, if you can't speak up when you know something is wrong, that is what I'm providing sort of knowledge about. This is why, these are the reasons why, and this is how we can overcome it.
So let's talk about some real world examples here where people can get a sense of what you're talking about, where it's not abstract and theoretical, but it's more, we're reifying this. So either things that people know about, like some of these you talk about in your book, sort of examples in the news, so to speak, that people know about, or, you mentioned your own kind of story in this, where you're a doctor, you went to get something was going on with your back, and they're like, hey, you need an x-ray. And you were like, why do I need an x-ray? Like, there's nothing broken. What do I need an x-ray? And this nurse or whatever is very incredulous about this. Like, well, that's the procedure. And you're like, but I don't need this. And I think you eventually acquiesced to this. I can't remember, maybe I have that wrong, but anyway, an example like that, where it, is a normal circumstance that comes up in people's lives where they should be thinking about it differently.
Sure. So I can tell you a little bit more about the story that you just said. So the first one was when I was experiencing this sort of central chest pain. And yes, I have medical knowledge. So that puts me in a different position in that I have some knowledge and understanding that other people might not have. And when I experienced this sort of chest pain, I was worried about it because I'd never experienced anything like that before. And so my immediate thought was that I was having some kind of heart attack or something cardiac was going on. Right. So I wanted to go,
not too back.
Not back. Yes. But so I did go to the emergency room, and they did hundreds of tests, including an electrocardiogram, which showed that everything was fine. Right. So my pain was then subsiding, and I just thought I was going to be discharged. Now here, the doctor said, okay, that's great, but before you go, I want you to have a CT scan. Now, a CT scan is on average about 70 times more radiation than an X-ray. It's still a small amount, but it's still ionizing radiation. So why have it when you don't think it's necessary? Because what they were interested in was whether I had a pulmonary embolism. Right. And I worked in respiratory medicine in the UK, and I know that this pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot in the lungs, it has a specific type of pain that we call pleuritic chest pain. So it's very sharp. It catches your breath when you breathe in and you breathe out. That was not the type of pain that I had experienced. The pain was going away. I was not at all worried about a pulmonary embolism. So I should have said no to the CT scan. And yet I couldn't. And the only reason I couldn't was because the doctor told me to have the CT scan, and I didn't want to question her judgment. I didn't want to say, I don't think it's necessary. I didn't want to insinuate that they didn't know what they were talking about.
Yes.
And so I ended up going along with it and then regretting it because, yes, I didn't want to expose myself to ionizing radiation, but I also believe in patient autonomy and do no harm. And this is a context where we're supposed to have informed consent, right? Which is another aspect, and another aspect that's an ideal. And I really wanted to say no, but I couldn't say no in that situation. And so I had to really think about afterwards, why did I just go along with that and not say anything? And then a year later, I was back in an outpatient clinic because I had some pain in my shoulder. And yes,
you're right.
You combine the two together.
Combine the two, yes, right. Yeah.
And as I was sat, I wanted, I was pretty sure I had inflammation and I wanted a referral for physical therapy, but I needed, because of my insurance, to get a referral from a doctor. So I went to this outpatient clinic to see the doctor, and I was sat there in the waiting room, and an assistant came to take me in. She had scrubs on, some kind of technician, and we started walking, and I looked down the corridor and I could see this big sign saying X-ray. And I just thought to myself, wouldn't it be hilarious if she was taking me for an X-ray before I see the doctor? And then we walked closer and closer to it. And so then I asked her, where are we going? And she said, to get an X-ray. And I was like, well, I haven't seen the doctor yet. And she said, all new patients have an X-ray. And I thought, well, how does the doctor know I need an X-ray? Because our training in medicine is that you see the patient, you take a history and an examination, then you come up with a list of differential diagnosis, what you think is wrong with the patient, and only then do you recommend investigations if it's going to change clinical outcome. Now, inflammation doesn't show up on an X-ray. So I was like, well, I think I should see the doctor first. And that sort of whole thing blew up, and every single person I saw after that would open my file and say no X-ray, and they did make me feel like I was being, a disruptive or difficult patient. But again, why would they follow that format if it wasn't just if it wasn't a for-profit clinic really to get more imaging? So by the time I saw the doctor, he also asked the same question, no X-ray. And I said, well, no, you haven't seen me yet. You haven't examined me. And we discussed it. And he said, well, like to have x-rays done. And I said, why? What's your differential diagnosis? And he said, bone cancer. And I said, really? You think I have bone cancer? And he was like, no. And then he just said, this is how we practice medicine here. So it was just such an odd statement, since that's not how we're trained to practice medicine, that I managed to say no, and I managed to leave. And I felt quite good about getting my referral for physical therapy. I told him if the pain was still there in 6 weeks, I would come back. Luckily, I never needed to. But the fact that he said that, and I told a few people about it, and my colleagues was like, you should write that up. So I did write the story about investigations before examinations, and it did get published in a top medical journal. And that filled my inbox with many things. So physicians sort of saying, yes, this is how, it's terrible that we think about efficiency rather than sort of focusing on the patient. And there's other places where we are asked to do investigations before examinations. We can't change unless the system changes. So it did have this ripple effect. So even when you think it's something quite small, sort of standing up for what you believe in and know about and can connect with sort of values really can make a difference. Do I expect that particular doctor to change his clinic? Maybe not. But if somebody else was to ask him that, maybe for a second or two, he might think about whether this is a good practice or not. Yeah. And if more people did it, then people become aware of it, and hopefully we can create some change.
Where do we draw the line on that, though? Because this is, obviously you have expertise there. You're a doctor, yes. And you can say, hey, I know what's going on. Like the whole thing with the embolism, I wouldn't have known any of that.
Yes.
And I don't think most people would have.
Yeah.
And so I think you have a leg to stand on there. But for the rest of us that are not doctors, let's just stay in this field, because I think it is really relevant to kind of what's going on in society these days. I think for the longest time, it was like, well, you trust doctors. Doctors are right. They know what they're doing. They've been to medical school. They're super smart. And
yes.
And now, because of the internet and information being out there for everything, as stuff like that happens and things are proven to like, well, actually, that's not necessarily right, or that was kind of unethical, or there was a conflict of interest there. There's a wave of mistrust now that is out there where it can swing the other way, where it's almost like we don't trust any expertise out there anymore. So How do we combat that shift? Because what you're saying is right. There should be circumstances where we say, I don't think that's right, and here's why I don't think it's right. But we also need institutions with expertise and can't just completely disparage everything about them, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. Like we do have a high level, or at least we used to have a very high level of trust in doctors, and yes. It would be a real shame if that public trust disappeared. But we also, when we think about what's really helpful in this situation, yes, I had a level of expertise, is to really understand what we mean by informed consent, because we often conflate compliance and consent together, but they're actually fundamentally different. So compliance is just simply going along with something. It's kind of sliding into it without thinking, or feeling that we need to say yes, even though we don't want to say yes. That's compliance. Consent, and informed consent in medicine actually requires 5 elements to be present. So the first one is capacity, right? You need to have the mental capacity to make a decision. So physicians should assess their patients to see that they're not sick, they're not under the influence of drugs and alcohol when they're consenting. So do they have the capacity to consent? And we can apply this actually to other important decisions that we make in life. It doesn't have to be just about medical decisions. So we need capacity. We also need knowledge. So we need information about the particular decision that we're going to make. And we need to make sure it's not misinformation or other things that you mentioned that could sort of steer our thinking, but it's accurate knowledge. And so we also need understanding of that knowledge, a really good grasp of the risks, the benefits, the alternatives. So I had both of those things. Often in situations we don't. But if we are making an important decision, it's important for us to really seek out that knowledge and understanding. So capacity, knowledge, understanding. The fourth one is the freedom to say no. Because if you don't have the freedom to say no, that's merely compliance. It's not consent. So in order to consent, you should be able to say no. If those four elements are present, then you can give the fifth element, which is your thoroughly considered authorization of consent, or what I call a true yes. Or if you don't want to go along with it, your informed refusal or dissent. So when we're thinking about, oh, who do we trust or not? If we can think about those 5 elements of consent, which are also the same 5 elements that we need to say no, and for defiance, that's when we can make that type of informed decision. So we're not talking about sort of knee-jerk reactions of, you know, I'm just not going to go along with that person, without fully understanding the situation and having a full grasp of the facts.
On the X is brought to you by Mechanics Wear. Mechanics Wear gloves are kind of the go-to glove, I think, for most people out there, whether it's working around the house or on the job or some kind of tactical setting. That's certainly been the case for me throughout my life. And they've made a whole bunch of improvements to the gloves that they have out there. So they've got the kind of original series here with the Velcro backing, the Velcro close that most people can use in sort of everyday settings, very ubiquitous for various things that you might want to do. Then they've got these fast fit ones, which you essentially just slide on. There's a little loop there around the wrist where you can pull them on. And then they've got the Impact series, which has a reinforced backing to protect your knuckles. And then they've got this lock ring reinforcement around the thumb now, where there's a lot of wear and tear. There's a whole bunch of other improvements to these. And if you go to their website, they literally have a 5 to 7 minute video about each one of these sets of gloves and all the improvements they've made, from the material, reducing the seams, making them more reinforced, making them more moisture wicking. It's clear that they put a lot of care and attention into their gloves. And if you listen to the guy talk on the website, they really love gloves. And I think that that comes out in everything they do. When I'm going out to a hardware store and I'm looking for some gloves, I almost look at everything else as just kind of a cheap knockoff. So definitely my go-to glove, highly recommended. Mechanics Wear gloves, they're available at most retailers on mechanicswear.com and GSA Advantage, and they're proud to offer an exclusive 15% off discount through the ID.me program to military veterans and first responders. So check them out. There's a thing you didn't use the term in there, but it's a piece of this insinuation anxiety term that you have, which is a really interesting idea that I hadn't thought about, which is people are resistant to defiance or saying no because they worry about that making the other person feel like they don't trust them, right? That's kind of the idea.
Yes.
And so, and the examples you use are like in a conflict of interest too, where someone says, there's this thing about like this, a certain amount of money, and this other thing where it's like a, but you might get more if you go this way. And then the guy reveals, oh, but if you do this other one, which is less odds of getting money, but I get a bonus. And people they go along with it because to resist that, even though there's a clear conflict of interest, they feel like, well, yeah, but it's saying I'm not trusting, which is so weird, because you would think pointing out a conflict of interest is like, that's on them, right? So
yes. Yeah.
Why do we do that? That's such an interesting thing.
Insinuation anxiety is one of the most powerful forces that keeps us compliant and silent. So I didn't mention the name for it, but when we were talking about the CT scan, why did I just go along with it? Because I didn't want to imply that the doctor didn't know what they were doing or that they were untrustworthy. And we do this a lot. We go along with people just so we don't send that negative signal to the other person, that, because it really is this aversive emotional state of, we become so concerned with offending the other person. And what I've seen in my experiments is these relationship concerns, even in one-off situations with strangers. We don't want to insinuate that our advisors, our co-workers, or our friends are untrustworthy. And one of the experiments that you described partly there was what I call the ferry study, where we had like a middle-aged white man approach passengers on a ferry going from Connecticut to Long Island and ask them to fill out a survey for $5. And the survey was just innocuous questions such as how clean is the ferry, was it running on time, things like that. I wasn't very interested in those answers, but I was interested in what happened after they finished the survey, which was when the man said, oh, I can give you the $5 as promised, or you can enter this mystery lottery where you get between $0 and $10, but the average expected payment is less than $5. So when he just presented it as just two options, only 8% of people took the mystery lottery. So 92% was taking, give me the cash, give me the $5 cash. Sure thing. Right. So that really reveals the preference of most of the people, most of the passengers. But in another condition, the man sort of gives the two options and said, oh, I think you should go for the lottery. That's all he says, just recommends you go for lottery. Then you see that go up to 20%. Now, the next condition with the disclosure of the conflict of interest is really fascinating, where the man says, I think you should go for the lottery, and I should let you know that I'm incentivized to recommend that because I also receive a bonus if you go for the lottery. So there it is, he's revealed his conflict of interest. Now we see that people do trust the man far less. They even like him less, which is the expected response to a conflict of interest disclosure. But if that's the case, you shouldn't go along with the advice. And what we actually see is now the compliance has more than doubled to 42% that are taking the lottery. Why? Why would you do that? If you trust the advice less, you like the man less, why are you doing that? Because they don't want to imply that the man is biased by this conflict of interest, because now rejecting the advice insinuates that the person is biased, or they're only giving you that advice because of their ulterior motive, which could be true, but we don't want to insinuate that. So it becomes like almost this charade of politeness. And that is really to save the face of the other person. And you can also see it in any type of work meeting that people go in and somebody makes a comment that you think is like either sexist or racist or just stupid. And it's very hard to call them out because it implies that they are. And like this one scenario I sort of describe in the book as well, which is about a junior faculty member being part of a committee with 4 senior white men, and they were assessing grant applications to see who should receive a grant or not. And there was one application that the woman thought that the conversation changed and it became more about negative gossip than about the quality of the application. And she wanted to say something. But when she came out, she was like, the one thing that I could not do is what I wanted to do. And that was just to say something that we're not going along with the credentials or the criteria. And she said, but having met all 4 of these people for the first time, I didn't want to question their integrity. So that is classic insinuation anxiety. And what's fascinating about it, especially in that situation, is that we don't want to imply that the other person is untrustworthy or lacking integrity. But in some ways, we might compromise our own integrity if we don't say anything. So we do so much to save the face of the other person, we forget the other consequences of not saying anything, like what's happening to that grant applicant. You know, don't they really need this? What effect is it going to have on them? Like, are we actually doing something fair or not? And we don't speak up for the things that we really believe in, which is fairness and other values that we really sort of hold dear to ourselves. So it's a fascinating thing. And once I start talking about insinuation anxiety, people give me so many different examples, including like some home renovations that they never wanted but couldn't say no to. So many different things that I've heard of.
There's a couple of things that strike me about that example too, the more I think about it. One is, like, I'm trying to imagine myself in that scenario. And I wonder if I would feel exactly that way, in the sense that, okay, the guy's revealed his conflict of interest. So at least he's being honest with me, right? That like, okay, there's a conflict here. the same time, I could see going along with it because, not because of, I think he's gonna like a trust issue, but more like, well, it's just $5 and this is his livelihood, and I don't want to like shirk him on his bonus, right? Like there's a piece of that could be that. The other thing that I think about is, I hadn't thought about this until just now, where I feel this pressure these days is tipping.
Yes.
Tip pressure, right? Because everywhere you go, it basically says how much you're going to tip. And it's like, I have that like, oh, I guess I got a tip, right? Because the person's going to not think I'm, it's not a trust thing. It's more like, they're just gonna be like cheapskate, right? Where that never was a thing before. It was like most places, restaurants, obviously you tipped the wait staff, but outside of that, it wasn't like at the register at a coffee shop or anything like that. It was just, you pay for what and now it's always in your face to 18%, right? And yes. I just wonder like how we handle that. Cause I so much want to be like, no, like I'm not because the service is bad or anything like that, but it's just like, I can't be tipped to death. Like,
right. And I think, yes. So there's a number of things in that comment that I want to address them all, but let's just address the tipping first of all, which is very much, it changes by country and culture. So
sure. Yes,
in the UK, for example, yes. I just went back to the UK earlier this month and I'd completely forgotten you don't tip in these situations. That is just very normal to tip in the US. Yeah. So there is some aspect of that. And there was some research done, I think, on when taxi drivers sort of had changed to sort of, you can just tip them whatever, to having these default sort of percentages. And I think they started with 25. And what they found was either people just complied with it or they just gave 0 tip now because they thought it was like starting at too high of a percentage. But going back to what you were saying about in that particular scenario, you mentioned a couple of things of why you might want to go along with them, because it's either only $5 or that you are rewarding their honesty, or it's just some, So what you're talking about is honesty and warm altruism. So let me address those because I conducted a series of experiments to look exactly at this with these types of lottery experiments where you can either take lottery A or lottery B, and lottery A is far superior. It's like more than 2 times the expected value. And we give people full information so they can see what's in the lottery and what the odds are. And what we see here is that we can rule out both of those explanations, because what we do is that we have people make the choice in front of their advisor, and there's very high compliance. And here we're seeing very high levels. So we're seeing, with the disclosure of the conflict of interest, sort of 85, 90% compliance with this. But what happens is, if they have an opportunity to change their mind, so they make that decision in public, then they have an opportunity to change their mind when the advisor goes away. It goes down drastically, significantly. And so people are changing their mind once the advisor walks away. So what does that show us? First of all, it shows us that they're not rewarding honesty, because if they were, they would keep their choice. And it's not warm altruism either, because what's happening is their public decision is very different from their private preference. And just having them make the decision in private, or having them have an opportunity to change their mind, like both actually are great interventions if you feel pressurized to go along with something, is to give yourself some time to think about it in private or have the opportunity to change your mind, because that is when your real preference comes to the forefront, not what you feel pressurized to do.
Yeah. Okay.
IRONCLAD creates world-class visuals that resonate anywhere. We thrive on crafting content that captures the essence of your brand in any setting. Why blend in when you can stand out? Ready to take your message to the next level? Start your journey with us at ironcladagency.com. Let's make your vision a reality, anywhere and everywhere.
So most of these scenarios that we've talked about are sort of, it's with a stranger or it's with someone you might see occasionally, like a doctor or something like that. It's not even necessarily your primary care provider, so it's not something you would see, or somebody you would see often. But what about internally to organizations? So like in the workplace, right, where you feel like you need to defy something or disobey, whatever term we want to use there, where you're like, hey, for whatever reason, but that's a different scenario because like your livelihood is at stake potentially, and your relationship with your coworkers. These are people that you see or at least talk to if you work remotely all the time. How do you tackle that?
Yeah, so in a number of ways, really. So again, what are we defying on? Like, it doesn't need to be confrontational. So one of the myths about defiance is that it's has to be loud and aggressive, yeah, but it doesn't. We think about defiance as having this, having a strong personality or being larger than life, but actually they're myths. If defiance is simply acting in alignment with your values when there's pressure to do otherwise, you can do it in your own way. Like, you can have quiet defiance. You can do it. It's just finding a way to do it with far less angst and stress than you used to have. And it could be as simple as asking clarifying questions. Like, for example, the woman in the grant committee could ask, what do you mean by that? Have you considered this? Should we go back to the criteria? It's not about being disruptive, but it's about doing the right thing in the situation and connecting with your responsibility and values to be able to do that. Because if a workplace is just completely compliant, how can you expect any creativity or innovation? If your boss is about to make a big mistake, you want your employees to actually speak up and say something. If nurses aren't speaking up, if they see physicians making errors, you want that. It's not that, oh, you're making the workplace worse. Actually, you're making it better in many different ways because you're changing things for the better. Because every single act of compliance, of consent, of remaining silent, of being defiant, they create the societies that we live in. They build them up. So it affects our lives, our communities, our workplaces, which is why we really need to think about when we should defy and when we should not. So if you look at whistleblowers, yes, you could say that they are being very disruptive, but they've probably tried lots of steps before. You don't need to go straight to sort of public whistleblowing. You can try internal dissent, talking to people, saying something's going on that's harmful. But what we normally get is either nobody speaking up and then you see the huge scandals afterwards, or we see whistleblowers that are taking huge risks and probably is costing jobs and relationships. And they're the people that are actually really connected with their values. They really believe in the mission of the organizations. And that is what causes them to defy, because they don't want to see these organizations, these institutions not living up to their values. So I find that fascinating that you think that these are the disruptive ones when actually they are the ones that are trying to do the right thing.
And I almost feel like whistleblowers, well, first of all, whistleblowers have protections for that exact reason, right? I mean, that's why.
But not enough, really not enough.
Fair enough. Yeah. But like the idea is it's supposed to be on its face value a good thing to do that,
right?
To have that ability, right? But it's almost like the reason it blows up and it's such a big deal is because, to your point, it's probably a situation where that organization, everybody has just been going along with everything for so long, right? So it's like all of a sudden, like the top blows off because there haven't been, to use your terminology there, like quiet acts of defiance that to help steer the organization in the right direction, right? It's just everyone's just kind of like, well, I guess I'll just go along with that. I guess I'll just go along with that. And then it takes somebody to go, hey, I gotta rock the boat.
Say something. Yeah. I mean, if you look at like even the Challenger disaster, like big scandals in the past, it's because most of the people don't speak up. You might get a handful of people that do, and either they could be successful or not successful, but it's very difficult to go against the flow if the culture is, no, we're just going to be quiet.
I had not, you talk about the Challenger disaster in there. I didn't even know that. I didn't know that there were people that were saying you're going to kill people, and they still went along with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And which is obviously like the worst example of a scenario like this, right?
Right. And that's like one of the exercises I do with my executive students is it's part of like group culture in a way that first of all, I give them sort of some data and some scenario that's very similar. Like, but I make it about sort of cars racing, and the data behind it all like sort of replicating sort of the Challenger disaster. And I ask them to make an individual decision, which they do. Some say yes, some say no, based on various different things. And then they get into groups, and then I ask for just one spokesperson from that group to give me the answer. Will you race or not? And what I see is yes, 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 yes. Right?
Yeah.
Very rarely I see no. And so I'm taken away. You said go, you said launch. And yet there's this dissent behind the scenes that doesn't come to the forefront. And some people are adamant, like, this is not what we should do. We've got a big risk here. We could be risking life. And so we really do need to find ways for that dissent to be successful. And yet, like, I know that if I had been in that situation, it's a very difficult one, because if we haven't trained for defiance, we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to enact it. We don't know how to speak up. And the engineers that did speak up regarding the Challenger disaster, they never regretted speaking up. The only thing that they regret is there anything more I could have done? You know, so
yeah.
And there was and you're right, there were consequences for them, in that some were blackballed, some like went to early retirement, and we do. And as I said, there's many costs for whistleblowers as well. So we do need to consider those costs. Like, the two questions that we really think about within an organization of whether to defy or not is it safe and is it effective? And defiance is never risk-free. You know, it's never going to be without some element of risk. So yes, could it cause damage to a relationship or to your job or financial situation? We need to be aware of those. But what we often ignore is the other side of the equation, is the costs of continued compliance. Because if we're continuously bowing our head to other people, if we're continuously disregarding our values, it really does take a toll on us, you know, not just emotionally or psychologically. All these, it can affect us physically with chronic stress and burnout, dissatisfaction, all of those things, if we're completely ignoring what our values in those situations and going against them.
Are there ways that you tell companies or leaders to sort of imbue the organization with a sense of defiance? Because that's a hard thing, right? If I'm the CEO of an organization, come out like, all right, everybody, I want you all to be defiant, right? Like, you're not going to do that. But certainly, like in the military, it says, I think in the UCMJ, like, if you are required to disobey an illegal or immoral order, right?
Right.
And yet all the time people still do things where they go, I was just following orders, right?
Yes.
Because we think that sort of absolves ourselves of responsibility. So how do you cultivate that in an organization from the top down, where you thread that needle appropriately, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that just following orders, that was the Nazi refrain as well, and which is why Milgram also decided to do these experiments. Are you just going to follow the orders, or are you going to connect?
Can you
with your
explain that
values?
experiment to people that aren't familiar with it?
Sure, absolutely. So these were, you could almost say, infamous studies that were conducted at Yale in the early 1960s. And one of the reasons that Stanley Milgram really wanted to conduct the experiments was because after World War II, he wanted to see if that statement, I was just following orders, was really a psychological reality for people or not. And so he advertised for people in the community to come in to take part in an experiment that he had sort of represented as a learning experiment. Does receiving electric shocks help us learn better? And so he had people come in, and one would be the learner and one would be the teacher. In fact, everybody that came in from the community, they were all teachers. The learner was an actor, a man that was put in a separate room that the teacher saw, and they saw that he was strapped to something that looked like an electric chair. And they were then brought to another room and sat in front of this sort of elaborate box that was created, starting with 15 volts, going all the way up to a dangerous 450 volts that was labeled XXX, danger, severe shock. And what the teacher had to do was read out some word pairs through a microphone to the learner, and the learner had to repeat them back. If they made a mistake, they had to receive an electric shock starting in 15 volts and then going up in these 15 volt increments all the way to 450. So the learner, the actor, who was sat in this electric chair type situation, also said that they had a heart condition. And at, yes, at 150 volts, they were, saying that this was really not great. They wanted to leave. They were pounding on the room about 300 volts. And then after 300 volts, there would be no answer whatsoever, which is kind of ominous as to what has happened to the learner. Like they weren't responding to the word pairs. There was no sound at all. So you can imagine what it feels like as a teacher with the experimenter in the room telling you to go on with the experiment, even if you question them. So they would read out the word pairs. If the learner got it wrong, they would give them an electric shock. They would go up and up in the number of volts until it was extremely painful, extremely dangerous. And beforehand, the prediction from psychiatrists was that most people wouldn't continue after 150, less than 4% after 300, and maybe about 1 in 1,000 would go all the way up to 450. And what Milgram found was that every single person went up to 150 volts. Every single person pulled the lever for 300 volts, and about 65% went to 450 volts. So that was shocking in itself, right? That is
crazy.
Why are people doing this? And it's this obedience to authority because they are abdicating their responsibility, or at least that is what Milgram said, that they're abdicating their responsibility. And for some people that's true. For other people, you could see when I read the experiments, is what I notice is that many of the subjects had signs of tension. So there was nervous laughter, there was questioning, there was squirming, there was sweating, there was swearing, there was asking questions. You can tell these people are not comfortable doing this. They don't want to go to 450 volts. They just don't know how to say no. And that is what we need to develop. If you have not been trained to defy, you can't suddenly sort of wish that skill on yourself in the moment. You have to practice for it before the moment of crisis. You have to get comfortable with how to say no when somebody is telling you to do something that you think is wrong, which is harming someone else. And if we don't know how to do it, if we don't know how to connect with our values, if we don't have the skill set, it becomes really, really difficult for us to say no.
Yeah. That's one of those things where it's shocking, the percentages in there. It's a part of the pun. But
yes,
at the same time, you have to wonder, what would you do in that scenario? Right?
Exactly.
Like if that prevalent, if that number of people go all the way through with that, I sit here and think to myself, like, would I do that? Would I go that far with that if I were in that scenario? I mean, I hope not, obviously, but man.
And this is what I call the defiance empathy gap as well. Like we can sit sort of in our armchairs and say, oh, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. I would do this. I would do that. And all these things about our aspirational selves. But what my research has shown me again and again, what somebody believes their values to be is quite different from how they actually behave in a situation. So how do we decrease that gap? Because we wouldn't want to do that. Right. And so in that, this is why I have the Defiance Compass, which really takes us through the questions that we ask. And the last one is, what does a person like me with these values, which whether it's not causing harm to anyone else, integrity, fairness, all that, what does a person like me do in a situation like this to get us to tap into our aspirational selves rather than just be taken along with the situation in the moment? And that is what we need to do, is decrease that gap between what we would like to do, what we aspire to do in a situation, and what we actually do.
Yeah, yeah. I think I skipped over because I interrupted about the electric shock experiment here, but just getting back to the sort of organizational, imbuing the organization with the principles, this kind of principle, how you best go about doing something like that.
Yeah, so people are fascinated with that because if you have an organization that's completely compliant, it's not actually a good thing. And good leaders know this, that employees will ask 2 questions when they want to tell you that something is wrong, and whether they're going to speak up about it, or what we call about creating a sort of safe culture where people can have voice, which means that they can speak up. They're not just silent. And that's the two questions that they're asking themselves is it safe for me to do so? And will it be effective? And so I interviewed both nurse managers and nurses. And what I see is that these are the questions that nurses are asking, like, why didn't you speak up when you saw that mistake? Why didn't you speak up? And it's like, so first of all, there is some fear of safety. What's the consequences if I speak up? You know, am I going to be fired? Or other nurses were saying, actually, I don't have any fear. I've spoken up many times before, but nothing happens. And that's why I stopped speaking up.
Yes, of course.
So as a leader, you want to do two things. You want to make it psychologically safe for people to speak up. And when you actually look at sort of medical units and things, it's the units that report the highest number of errors that are actually the safest, because they're the ones that are not penalizing people for speaking up so they can catch the error. So it's kind of like the reverse of what you would expect, really, is that you want people to speak up and report these things so you can figure out what can we do, what structures can we put in place, what processes can we put in place to prevent this. So as a leader, you want to make it also psychologically safe that you can speak up about a mistake, you know, and you want to show that you're doing something about it when they speak up, not just ignoring it. So they're the two key things that leaders can take on board to change their cultures. And also they should also model defiance. So if they feel something's not going right from whoever they report to, maybe different stakeholders, maybe if you're a middle manager, you have people above you, then your employees, your direct reports want to see that you're also modeling defiance.
Right. Yeah, I hadn't focused on the ineffectiveness, but that's for sure a situation where it's like, why even bother? Nothing ever changes.
Right.
Anyway.
Nothing ever changes. Yes.
Yeah. You kind of mentioned this sort of almost like a mental checklist for people of like, when should I be defiant? Right. Like, okay, if these scenarios are met, these stipulations are met, that's when I should do it. What is that for people if they've got kind of like a checklist in their mind that they may want to run?
Yeah. So there's different checklists, but let me talk about the Defiance Compass, which is the first one is really, the first question is, who am I? So there's three big questions in this Defiance Compass, and it leads back to the self. So the first question is, who am I? And that is really explicitly knowing what your values are. People don't often explicitly write them down. And I have all my executive students do this, because if you can clarify what your values are, it is more likely you're going to act in alignment with them. And it's also really great because it lowers your stress response. People who know who they are and what they stand for have lower cortisol levels. So it's really an exercise worth doing. And there's many ways to get to your values that I explain, you know, that you can really recognize, oh, I really believe in fairness, or really believe in equality. There's many ways to get to that to really understand. But when you think about values, they're not goals. They're not moral convictions that something is right or wrong, because that's subjective and could have two answers. They're things like integrity, benevolence, compassion. So very simple, often single words that can have a powerful effect if only we could enact them every single day,
yes.
Which is what we struggle with.
I'm so with you on this. I think this is a really important drill. Yeah.
So that's the first one. Who am I? The second question is, what type of situation is this that we just covered? Is it safe? Is it effective? So we really do have to look at the external environment, and we can get quicker at doing that. The third question is, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? What does a person like me with those values that I identified do in a situation like this? Because the way that we act should affect who you are. Because if you often hear from people when they do something, they'll say, oh, that wasn't me. That's not me. But if you're doing it over and over again, actually, it is now you, right? Yeah. That is the value you're expressing, and you're doing it over and over again. So it does change who you are if you can't act in alignment with them. There are other checklists in the book that you can look at too. And, you know, especially within institutions, you don't have to jump directly to whistleblowing or principled exits. There's other steps that you can take. But one of the key things is really to sort of change your mindset from thinking about defiance as having a particular personality or a negative connotation, and just realizing it's a skill set. And in order to develop that skill set, we need to be able to practice it.
Yeah. That's great. I love that. The last thing I kind of think about in this regard is how do we know when to defy in a world of misinformation, right? Because so many people, there's a lot of people out there that are defiant, voraciously defiant, potentially, that are acting on bad information where they think they're in the right. And that's tough because there is a lot of misinformation out there. So how do we combat that potentially?
Yeah. So it's a really great question, because now when we think about the 5 elements of consent and dissent, so that knowledge and understanding, we need to be very discerning about that. Like, what is the source of the information, and really think critically about it. When we, I see a lot of false defiance, especially on what I call false defiance on social media, where it's the defiance is mainly performative, like it's done to get views or to get likes. That's not the type of constructive defiance that I'm talking about. I would call that false defiance because you're doing it to get a reaction from other people. It also goes back to sort of perhaps teenagers and other things, like what type of defiance is just acting in alignment with your values for yourself. But yes, you do need accurate knowledge and good understanding. And that's where some of the work comes in, that now we do live in a world of where it's easy to get misinformation. Where are you getting your news from? What is the source? How can we sort of become a little bit more discerning as to the information that we take in and have some level of critical thinking?
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough. I mean, it's a really hard thing because I think we all need to do it. You know, even those of us that are out there thinking we're righteous or we're on the right side here. It's like, well, we really should question that, you know, as much as we're asking other people to.
And when it comes down to when we think about our values, I would say what I see over and over again is that my executive students will always put integrity. That is a value that people have at the top. If you say someone lacks integrity, it's just one of the worst insults you can give them. Sure. And so that really means that in situations where we can just sort of see, should I harm someone else? Should I behave in a trustworthy way? That those acts that we do on a daily basis, they're the ones that are creating society in reality. And so going back to those values, we can see, am I creating harm to someone else? Am I actually acting with compassion, with my values of being trustworthy? They're questions that we can ask every day. And sometimes it doesn't require a lot of information to do that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm big on the value thing. I think that's right on. So, well, thank you so much for coming on. The book is Defy. It's great. And if someone wants to learn more about you, connect with you, where can they do that?
So absolutely, they can go to my website, sunitasah.com. That's SUNITA Sah, SAH.com. I have a newsletter called Defiant by Design on Substack, which is a free newsletter where I delve more into the research every month. And if you go to my website, you'll see all the connections on social media if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram or elsewhere.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an Ironclad original series sponsored by Mechanics Wear. Learn more at NavySealFoundation.org or text On the X to 60104. See you next time.
For the past 15 years, we've been known as the turnkey branded content company, right? That means that we take brand and content to the next level. So if you're Garmin and you want us to shoot your new watch at the side of a cliff in the middle of Colorado, we source the location, we get the permits, we find the talent, we get the side-by-sides. We make everything happen for a world-class piece of branded content. And that's really where we've kind of cut our teeth. And about 5 years ago, we launched Ironclad Originals as the second part of Ironclad. So you've got the branded content on one side, and you've got Ironclad Originals. And what Ironclad Originals is, intellectual properties by way of franchises that can start as a podcast, build an audience, and develop into a film or series that can be licensed or purchased by a major streaming platform. So to date, we've launched 8 Ironclad originals. Every one of them has topped the charts on Spotify and Apple and have grown to today over 5 million downloads a month. We're doing partnerships with Warner Brothers, major sporting networks, and many, many other brands to bring their product to our audience by way of our podcast. Now, you may have seen some of our podcasts with Andy Stumpf, Vincent Vargas, Dom Rosso. We're launching 4 more this year. So these Ironclad originals are going to continue to evolve, continue to grow, and by the end of this year, our target is to have 10 million unique audience members on the Ironclad original platform. Now, these two sides of Ironclad are really yin and yang to one another, and you can come in on either side of that. One note is, the branded content and the original content has come together for one more unique offering called a brand podcast. We've taken all of our expertise on the Ironclad original side, mixed with the service-based business of the branded content, and now we're providing branded podcasts. That's a turnkey podcast that we can launch from 0 to full scale within 60 days. And we'll do 52 weeks of unique content where we build the studio, build the brand, book the guest, edit the shows, host the shows, engineer the shows, take everything that makes an Ironclad original unique, apply it to a brand, and build owned content for our brand partners that can take a brand to a whole nother level. You know, as we close this out, I just want you to think, this is something that you should be doing, whether it's with or without Ironclad. We truly believe that you should be creating brand podcasts. We truly believe you need the best branded content in the world. We truly believe you need a partner that can tell your story at an elite level. Okay, so this is something that you need to be doing with or without Ironclad. But one thing about Ironclad is that we are drinking our own Kool-Aid. We believe in this so much, we're investing in originals. We are testing the waters. We have the connections happening on this side of the house. We're proven and tested on the brand side. And we promise that if you come to us, we will bring all those resources together and bring them to you. And we will be an extension to your team to make you operate at an elite level. So those are the things that we're offering here at Ironclad. We're so excited. Thank you so much for all your support. We love you all.